Well, how's everybody doing? I'm feeling tired. I know that it's that time of day, so we'll do the best we can with this. So we're going to talk about of C.S. Lewis's one of the themes in C.S. Lewis's writings that was very central to his thought. This idea of longing and desire, and actually it's an argument that is fascinating in its own right, and I think it's way underutilized. Like, people probably don't appreciate how much is in this argument. And so what I want to do, and there's a handout in the back, I think. Is it on the back? Yes. I can't see. There's a handout on the back chair there if you want. Yeah, so we're going to explore it, and my hope is by the time we're done here that you see how actually relevant this could be for our day and age, this argument, and especially as we think about cumulative case arguments for God. This is a key piece that I think is often neglected. So, okay. So let me give you, I'm going to give you a little pep talk for why we ought to care about our longings. Then I want to look at the argument itself, and I've given a sort of tight formulation of it, and then we'll just talk about it, okay? And so also, though, I do want to locate this just to give you sort of a context for, in terms of how people think about arguments for God. And sorry, I'm old school, so I'm on the blackboard here. But anyway, so this is kind of what I'm thinking. If you think about all the different arguments for God, here's one way that people can sort of parse them out, is you can talk about so-called external, oops, see, I can't even spell right now, external and then internal arguments for God. And then external arguments would be things where you pick some phenomena out there in the world, right? So just think of the cosmological argument that would go over here. It takes the world itself and you plug it into this argument, a premise in an argument, and you come to this theological conclusion. The teleological one is another one that would be over here, where you look at design and fine-tuning in the world, just things out there, so they're external. On the internal side, though, you have things like, this is actually another argument that Lewis was interested in, the argument from reason, where you're looking at some aspect of the human person, the human psychology, and then you're reasoning from there to a God. And so, the question here is what's first, mind or matter? And there's this argument that capital R, reason, is prior to matter in the world. And so that's called the argument from reason. And so if you look at, for example, Lewis's book on miracles, you'll find right there in the second chapter a really nice articulation of the argument from reason. And then, of course, there's the moral argument, which is another internal argument where we're looking within and we see this moral law that somehow that we're aware of. And of course, Lewis was really interested in this. And so read the first 5 chapters of Mere Christianity, and you'll see a famous articulation of the moral argument. And then there's the argument here, the argument from desire. And this is the one that I want to look at today. So this is where I would put it. It's an internal argument. It's focused on our longings. And it's interesting. So the way I'm thinking about it, and I'll just go over here, we've got if this is the set of all desires, and we have lots of them, right? We have desires for sleep or coffee. We have desires for Twinkies or whatever it is that you want to eat. But then we have deeper desires too. So think, if this is the set of all desires for you, the argument from desire says, let's just take one desire, and it's going to go find it. It's this one. We'll call it the transcendent desire. It's going to take one desire, it's going to examine it, we're going to look at it, we're going to think about it, and then it's going to plug it into an argument and see if it leads to a theological conclusion. So that's basically what we're doing here. This is what Lewis is doing here. Okay? Does that make sense? Are we good? All right. So with that, okay, so on your handout then I have 4 reasons why we should care about our longings. Okay? And actually, this is, I think, a very underutilized aspect in apologetics, is thinking about our longings. And so I just want to kind of walk through this, and then we'll sort of make our way to C.S. Lewis and his argument. But, okay, so here we go. So the first reason is very simple, is that humans are desiring animals, that we're desiring animals. If you think about it, we're driven largely by our passions, right? We're driven largely by our loves. Now, it's not just that. We have our beliefs as well, too, that are kind of the rails on which we run our lives, but it's our beliefs and our desires that drive us. And so, of course, we're desiring animals. Now, we're more than that, right? We're rational animals, as Aristotle would put it. We're moral animals and things like that, but we are desiring animals. In fact, the very first question in the Gospel of John that Jesus asks is, some would say, the most fundamental question that could ever be asked, and it's the question, what do you want? This is a question he asked of the disciples. And I think that's a really important question for us to think about, is this question, what do you want? And so in fact, here's the way that I'm thinking about it, just to sort of flesh this out a little bit more. There's a philosopher named Peter Kraft, and this is what he says. He says that God has created us with these three prophets of the soul. That's the language that he uses. And the three prophets of the soul are reason, our conscience, and our imagination. And the way that Kraft puts this is he says each of these prophets of the soul is on a quest. And it's on a quest for the object of its longing. So here comes the language of longing and desire. So what is reason after? You guys have heard this language today. What is reason on a quest for? Truth. Yeah. So reason's on a quest for truth. What do you think conscience is on a quest for? No, a little deeper. So goodness. Yeah, so conscience on a quest for goodness. And how about the imagination? What's it on a quest for? It's on a quest for beauty. And so we have these three prophets of the soul, reason, conscience, and imagination. They're on a quest for the object of their longing, truth, goodness, and beauty. These are the transcendentals that Plato talks about. And of course, to put that in the Christian context, where do these all find their source? In Christ, right? And so what's interesting here is if we pay attention to our longings, eventually they can lead us to the source, the object of our longings. That's basically what Lewis is going to formalize. Now, of course, God has given the philosopher and the scientist and the intellectual to help us with reason. And he's given us the moralist and the prophet to help us with the conscience. And he's given us the storyteller and the artist and the painter and folks like that to help us with the imagination. All right. So that's the first reason why we should care, is that we're desiring animals, right? We long for goodness, truth, and beauty, and all these other things. Okay, second reason there in your handout is paying attention to our longings actually awakens our soul. If you think about it, the besetting sin of our day would be apathy, I would say, or at least one of the besetting sins of our day is apathy. And so as a culture, we largely don't care about much. The way I would think about it is that we've become pacified, and so we've lost this vision for living, right? And so we don't have this vision of living a dramatic life. But that's, of course, what God has called each of us to, is to live a dramatic life. And so to borrow from Lewis again, we've all become addicted to Turkish delights, right? You guys remember these things? Right? These things were, for Lewis, this is from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but they're these chocolate, I guess they're not chocolates, but they're little candies. What's that? Yeah, there's some little candies. Yeah. But for Edmund, you know what happened? The minute that he has one, what does he think about? What can he think about? Nothing else but that candy. Yeah, and so for Lewis, of course, he's being brilliant. So what it represents is something that gives you an immediate sensual payoff, but ultimately ends up enslaving you. That's what a Turkish delight is, right? And so because of this, the fact that we're a culture that's sort of, I guess, addicted to these things, we have this new vice that's become sort of the dominant vice, and it's actually one of the 7 deadly sins. If you know, there's the 7 cardinal virtues and then the corresponding 7 deadly sins. Well, here's a distinctive sin of our age. It's called sloth. And what sloth means is basically spiritual lethargy towards God. Like we're just not interested. We're just not even seeking God. And it's a distinctly modern sin that our longings for goodness, truth, and beauty are in a large part muted because of this sloth. In fact, Pascal said it this way in the Pensées. He said that there's 3 kinds of people. He said basically there's the found, and the found are happy in the classic sense, that is, they are flourishing, and they're reasonable because they found union with God, the real purpose in life. And then there's the seeker, and the seeker is unhappy, right? They're not flourishing, they haven't found union with God, but they're reasonable because they're seeking. And then there's the non-seeker. And the non-seeker, according to Pascal, is both unhappy and unreasonable. And the non-seeker, and then there's actually a continuum here if you want to think of it in terms of the virtues. and the corresponding vice. Here we have the virtue of faith, the classic virtue of faith, and then over here we have the vice of sloth. And what I've seen, and what I would just present to you in our culture, is that we are shifting this way. In a disenchanted world, sloth is becoming the new virtue, of the day in some ways. Many people that just aren't seekers. And so in this, the gospel doesn't always get a fair hearing, right? And so if we help people by paying attention to our longings, I'm suggesting we can actually awaken, I think, these universal longings for goodness, truth, and beauty. Okay, so that's why we should care about this, especially given sort of where our culture's headed, okay? Okay, so that's number 2. Oh, and then, I see, let me talk a little bit about Lewis here, just so I can whet your appetite here. I have a little bullet point there. C.S. Lewis's 3 early experiences of longing for joy. So has anybody read Surprised by Joy? It's a spiritual autobiography. Yeah, just a couple. Okay, so if you haven't, I highly recommend it. Up to, Augustine's Confessions, the first spiritual autobiography of the Western world, C.S. Lewis, these are 2 of my favorites. Highly recommend to you. But in here, Lewis talks about at age 6, he had his first experience of beauty. And in fact, here's what he says. His brother came into his room that he was in, and he had basically it was a lid of a biscuit tin. And on the top of this lid, there's basically this sort of make-believe garden. And Lewis talks about at age 6, when his brother brought this tin in, he says, that was the first beauty that I ever knew. And it did something to him, right? So he has an experience of beauty, and it awakens something within him. In fact, he says, this is what he says. He says, I became at that moment, at age 6, a votary of the blue flower. So, that might be a little hard to understand. What does it mean to be a votary of the blue flower? Well, a votary is basically a devotee, a follower. And then the blue flower, for Lewis, what the blue flower was this mythic symbol in German Romantic literature that symbolized this object of intense longing that is always elusive, just out of our grasp, but that sort of propels us on. And so he says at age 6, beauty did something to him, right? It evoked something. In fact, Plato would say, this is what Plato says about beauty in the Symposium, he says that beauty evokes desire. And that sounds about right to me, right? Think about when you come in contact with beauty, whether it's in a person or nature or art, it does something to us, right? It evokes desire. And so Lewis had so that was his first experience with beauty. But then later on, as he's talking about his journey to Christ, he talks about these 3 experiences that sort of were formative in this. And let me just tell you the 3. It's kind of interesting. It's on the first chapter here of the book. The first one is actually what he calls a memory of a memory. But I want to read you the language that he says, because it's going to be important for where we're headed with the argument from desire. But basically, he was out walking on the hills there in Ireland where he grew up. And as he's staring across the hill, he has this memory of a memory. This is his first experience that he says. And the memory of the memory is the memory of when he was 6. And he saw that biscuit tin. And this is what he says. He says the memory, okay, let's see here. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me as he's thinking about this early experience of beauty. He says, Milton's enormous bliss of Eden, given the full ancient meaning of enormous, comes somewhere near it. Okay, so that's his first experience of beauty, of longing that he's beginning to pay attention to. The second one actually comes from when he was reading Squirrel Nutkin. This is Beatrix Potter. You might not remember this stuff from when you were a kid, but children's, like Peter the Rabbit, that's Beatrix Potter. And this is what he says about Peter and the Rabbit. It says, the second glimpse came to me through Squirrel Nutkin, through it only, though I loved all of Beatrix Potter's books, but the rest of them were merely entertaining. Squirrel Nutkin administered the shock. It was a trouble. It troubled me with what I can only describe as the idea of autumn. And so here's this early experience again, and it came through reading children's works, literature, and it awoke something within him. And the third one actually is through him reading poetry. He was reading Longfellow's Saga of the King Olaf, and one day he was flipping through it, and his eyes came on to this poem, and here's the words. That might not work for you, but this is what it was for him. He said, the words were this: I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead. He said, I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into the huge regions of northern sky. I desired, with almost sickening intensity, something never to be described, except that it was cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it. And so paying attention to our longings for Lewis, and I'm suggesting for all of us, awakens. It awakens us, right? And that's a good thing, especially when our culture is moving towards sloth. Okay? All right, let me keep going. 3. Third, our longings point to something that we've lost. You think about that for a minute. Our longings point to something that we've lost. Have you ever felt lonely? Well, there's such a thing as relationships, right? Have you ever felt hungry? Well, there's such a thing as food. And so paying attention to our longings actually reminds us of something that we lack, right? It's something that we've lost in a way, and that's going to be important. And then the fourth thing here, if faithfully followed, our natural desires will lead us to God. And there's this quote here by Lewis, but it's a great little quote, but basically he's talking here in this quote about this dialectic of desire that takes place, where you tether your longing to some false object of longing. It doesn't satisfy, so you untether it, and then you retether it to something else. And that doesn't satisfy, and so you continue to untether it and retether it somewhere else. And he says, if you faithfully follow this dialectic to its actual source, you'll actually find the true object, which is God. And so if we follow our desires faithfully, they can actually lead us to God. So that's, I guess I'm just suggesting to you, that's why we ought to care about this underutilized argument. So, all right, are you good? Are you with me? All right. And we can ask questions the whole way through. We don't need to wait to the end or anything. So if you have a question, just interrupt. Okay? All right. So with that, let's look at the argument. And it's pretty simple. I've tried to formulate it tight here. And so maybe let me just walk through it. Let me unpack a few of the premises, and then we'll have a discussion. And the key text there on your handout, you've got A and B. So there's 3 places that you can see. Actually, all of Lewis's work, fiction and nonfiction, is all, in many ways, the theme of longing is pretty much everywhere in all of Lewis's work. But there's 3 places specifically where you can find the argument from desire. The place that we'll look at here is from his chapter in Mere Christianity called Hope. So if you go find Mere Christianity, look up the chapter called Hope. It's about 5 pages long, not very short, not very long. You'll find basically the argument we're going to look at now. The other 2 places are his essay on the weight of glory, and then the appendix to the very first book he wrote after he became a believer called A Pilgrim's Regress. And he talks about it there. And so those are the 3 main places, but it's everywhere in his writings. You see it in his science fiction, you see it in Narnia, the Narnian stories, and so on. But really, we've just got these 2 sentences there, A and B. So look at sentence A there. This is from Mere Christianity. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. Okay? So that sentence can be formulated into a premise in an argument where if you switch over to the other side, you can see premise 1. So here's the argument, and that sentence I just read from Mere Christianity can formulate into this premise. All natural desires have a corresponding object that satisfies the desire. Okay? So I'll unpack that in a minute, but there's the premise. That's where it comes from Lewis. If you go back to the second sentence there, B, most people, if they have really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want and want acutely something that cannot be had in this world. Okay? So flip that over. That's premise 2. There exists in us a natural desire, and I'm going to call it a desire for transcendence, that nothing in the material cosmos can satisfy. Okay, so once you have that, you basically have the argument. Then just look at the rest of the argument. From 1 and 2, you get this third premise or conclusion. Therefore, there exists some object beyond the material cosmos that can satisfy this desire. Add one more premise, premise 4, the most plausible transcendent object of our longing is God. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Okay, so there's a very simple formulation of what this argument actually is. Okay? All right, so let me just kind of unpack it a bit, see if it's, make it flesh, give it a little flesh and show you that I think it's defensible, and then let's see what you think. But I want you to notice the conclusion here. If this argument works, it's actually quite astounding. I mean, we learn that God exists, number one. We learn that our deepest desire will find satisfaction in God. And we learn that there's something beyond the material cosmos. That's a lot of interesting information, right, that we learn from an argument like this. And so, in fact, one philosopher, Peter Kraft, he says that next to Anselm's ontological argument, he thinks this is one of the most fascinating arguments out there. Okay, so let's unpack it a bit. Let me just say a few things about each of the key premises here. So first of all, with premise one. So recall premise one says, hey, for every natural desire, there's some object. There's some corresponding object that satisfies that. So think about your desires. They're on a quest. They're on the quest for this object that will satisfy that desire. That's basically what premise one says. And so one of the things that I learned when I was in seminary is that if we want to be good thinkers, we need to learn to make distinctions. And so if we want to be good teachers, we need to learn to teach distinctions. And so let me just make some distinctions, and that will help sort of, I think, unpack what's going on with this one specific desire that we're concerned with here, okay? So let's make a couple distinctions. Are you good? Okay, didn't know if you had a question. All right, so natural versus artificial. First, let's make that distinction. What is that distinction? So I would say a natural desire is roughly something that we are born with, or at least born with the tendency to develop the desire, okay? So they tend to be universal. In fact, they would be universal. Unless the development is somehow impeded. Okay, so natural desire is something that we're born with, or at least we're born with the natural tendency to develop the desire. Examples are fairly common: food, sex, friendship, knowledge, beauty, and then of course each of these has things that we naturally turn away from: starvation, ugliness, loneliness, and so on. Ignorance and things like that. Okay, so that would be a natural desire. Contrasted with an artificial desire, let's just call that a learned desire. A learned desire. So a desire that's not spontaneous. A desire that's not universal. So examples here would be my desire for a Porsche. Not that I really want a Porsche, but if I did. Or my desire that the Cubs would win the World Series, or something like that. Or the land of Oz, or to fly like Superman. These are learned desires if I have those kinds of desires. Notice, though, with the natural desires, there is a corresponding opposite, right? With the artificial desires, there's no obvious corresponding opposite, right? Well, I want to fly like Superman. Well, what's the opposite of that? I don't know. And so those are things that can help us maybe discern. Another way to get at this is our natural desires come from within, and artificial desires come from without, usually marketing, advertising, things in the world that kind of impose these things upon us. Okay? So that's one key distinction. So of our set here, some are, we could kind of break it up here. Some are artificial, and some are natural. Another distinction there is between surface and deep desire. So this is how I'm thinking about it, is we think of our desires like an inverted triangle. And at the top here, we've got our surface desires. So my desire for Twinkies, it's up here. My desire for a car, a nice car, it's up there, surface desires. But then you can kind of imagine how there's some desires that are deeper. My desire for food, down here. And then there's really deep desires. I would say that right here we have things like our longing for goodness, truth, and beauty. These transcendentals, they're right there, right at the bottom. Goodness, truth, and beauty. And you could add more here: love, justice. These are all universal desires that we all have. And then there's the deepest desire. What's that? This is God. So we have our surface desires, our deep desires, and then our deepest. And our deepest desire, of course, is God. And so it reminds me of Augustine's famous sentence that he says in the first paragraph of the Confessions, where he says, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Right? This is the heart's deepest longing. But we have other desires. Okay? Does that help? Yeah.
Real quickly, when you say the longing for transcendence, do you mean goodness, truth, beauty, love,
Okay.
desire for God?
That's a great question. Lewis is not always clear. And so sometimes it's the deepest desire, our longing for God. But if you read like his chapter on heaven and the problem of pain, it's like, no, we long for all the world made right. We long for heaven, and that's the deepest desire. That's our transcendent longing. So it's somewhere in here is what I'm thinking for Lewis. And I'm actually ambivalent on, I think this is our deepest desire, but if somebody's not aware of that desire, I would just go right here then. Okay, well, what do you want? You want justice? Well, that's right here. And then let's follow that down to the deepest desire. Yeah, but it's, I mean, that's the one that we're after. But I think these are so close that we can use those to get down there. Yeah.
Just real quick, would you or Lewis say that a desire unfulfilled is always a bad thing?
A desire unfulfilled is always a bad thing. Depends.
If a desire never means it's what it's longing for.
Yeah.
Is that necessarily the thing?
Well, I think, so the interesting thing about the 7 virtues, the 7 cardinal virtues, so those would be as you know, the 4 classic virtues from the ancient world, courage, justice, wisdom, temperance. Then you add the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. So we got our 7. The interesting thing is the only virtue that we won't take to heaven is hope. We won't need it because in heaven, all of our longings will be satisfied. And so I think knowing Lewis as a classical scholar who read Plato and Aristotle and was in that tradition, I would think he would say that that in heaven, all of our desires will be fulfilled, including this one ultimately. Here on earth, I think there's, God uses these longings to woo us to him. That's the dialectic of desire, right? And so the unfulfilled desires here are part of that dialectic if we faithfully follow it. Is that what you're wondering, maybe? Yeah. So they have a purpose for Lewis, and that's what this argument is showing. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So surface and deep, natural, artificial, and okay. So this bullet point, 2 lines of evidence in support of premise 1. So for both premise 1 and 2, there's 2 ways that we could justify the premise, right? So in any argument, you want to ask, are the premises plausible? Are they reasonable? You have good reasons to think they're true. And Lewis is, he's actually using 2 kinds of reasoning to justify the premises. And so let me ask you, so let's be good thinkers here for a minute. If I say, here's a universal claim, all men are mortal. So notice I'm making a claim about the set of all people, all men are mortal. How could I justify a claim like this? It's a universal generalization, a universal claim. How could I justify a claim like this? How would I go about proving that or showing this plausible? What do you think? Go to the cemetery. Okay. Good.
Fast forward like 120 years.
Okay, how would I do that?
Pull a time machine or something.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so if we had a time machine, barring a time machine, maybe the cemetery would be good, right? So in going to the cemetery, sorry, not seminary. That was a Freudian slip. Yeah, okay. What you're doing is you're looking at a sample size of humans, and then you're generalizing. Hey, everybody here died. And they're generalizing to the whole set. And that's actually that's called an inductive generalization. And so that's a good kind of reasoning. Now it's not foolproof, right? We could still make a generalization that's not right, especially if our sample size is too small or if it's not representative. But in this case, I think we're pretty safe on those grounds, inductively to generalize that this is true. There's another way, so that's called induction. So that's one way that you can support some kind of a claim like this. The second way that you can support a claim like this is you can just look within. It's called abstraction. So you can look within yourself, and then you could abstract to some principle. So for example, Plato actually said famously that all philosophy begins with this realization of our mortality. This is kind of a Platonic stream that you hear. And in fact, Plato said that philosophy is training us for death. Well, that's interesting. Why would he say that? Because he is looking within, and something that we learn about ourselves that we're immediately aware of is our finitude, right? We know that we are finite, our lives are temporally bound, and that we will one day die. Not just us, but all those around us will one day die. And so in that case, Plato was abstracting from his own experience to some universal generalization. And in fact, all of philosophy, in some ways, is training for death, right? Because you want to learn how to live well so you can die well. So that's called abstraction, okay? So there's 2 ways to justify what I'm going to call a universal statement. Okay? Those same two ways, induction and abstraction, are how he is going to justify the first premise and the second premise. On the first premise, he's going to look at some desires and notice that they all have a corresponding object and then conclude that all do. Okay? So that's an inductive generalization. He's also going to intuit from his own experience and then abstract the same premise, abstract to all desires. Okay? Do you kind of see how that works? Those are two good ways. They're not foolproof, right? But they're two good ways to show that these premises are more plausible than their denial. And he does the same thing for the second premise. The second premise, hey, look at cultures everywhere. They all worship God. That's sort of evidence, the democracy of the dead. Everybody worships God. Well, let's just generalize that we all have this longing for something beyond the material world. That's an inductive generalization. He's also looking within, looking at his own desire, and then abstracting that for everybody. Okay, so that's kind of how both premises are justified. Okay? All right, so that's a little bit on premise one and why it's plausible. Premise two, I just gave you a little bit about how that's justified. I will say, Paul and Mars Hill, there's some really cool stuff there. Paul arrives in Athens in chapter 17, verse 16. It says that he was distressed because the city was full of idols. And so he's looking around and there's just, objects of worship everywhere. So again, the democracy of the dead. But then you get to verse 27 in the speech that Paul gives, and he says basically, God is your creator, sustainer, ordainer, and he did all this so that you might seek me, so that you might seek him. That's the phrase if you look at Acts 17, verse 27. And it's interesting. So we're under obligation to seek God, says the Apostle Paul. And usually when we're under an obligation, the ought implies can, as some philosophers might say, or the obligation points to some fact that is the case. If we are obligated to seek him, well, maybe it's because we actually all do seek him, right? And so there's some interesting some reasoning that you can get even from Paul's speech in Mars Hill to support the truth of premise two. Okay. One more thing, I see there's one more thing, and then we can look at the last premise and talk about it. Now, for this one desire, for Lewis, it's different than all the other desires. Apart from the fact that it's our deepest longing, here's two other ways that it's different than all of our other desires for Lewis. This desire and this desire alone is pleasurable to have when you have the longing. Now, think about when you're hungry or tired. So you long for sleep. Is the longing itself pleasurable when you're hungry? I mean, if you intuit, no, it's not. It's the satisfaction of the longing that's the pleasure. But for this particular longing, the having of the longing itself is pleasurable. So that's something interesting if the phenomenology or the characteristics of this longing. The second thing for Lewis about this one longing, this gets to your question, Haley, is that this longing of all the other ones is elusive. As a distinct from all the other ones is elusive. It's not clear what the object of our longing is. It's somewhere in here, but it can remain elusive. And there's some reasons why he thinks it's elusive. But that's two things that we want to know as well for this particular longing. Okay? Okay, and then from there, as we follow the argument, the only other premise, and this is where I think it's kind of interesting, is that fourth one. Because as you get to the third premise there, that sub-conclusion, now we've established that there's something beyond the universe that exists, that satisfies this longing. And so now we want to know, well, if something exists beyond the material cosmos, what is the nature of that thing? And there's there's at least 5 candidate options I would suggest to you. And so maybe I'll just start walking through these, and if these interest you, we can talk more. And if they don't, we'll keep going, because I don't know if we're tired or what here. And so I'll just kind of walk through them. Okay, so what are the options? I've got 5 on your sheet there. Possible candidate options for this transcendent object that we long for. Okay, so here's the first one. Augmented or virtual realities. Well, that's interesting. Why would I put that? Think about our culture today. Technology is seen by many, especially in this sort of disenchanted world that we live in, technology is seen as the sort of great savior, right, from pain and suffering and things like that. And so in many ways, technology offers a new kind of transcendence to those in our world. Think about the phenomena of Pokemon Go last summer. Everybody was going berserk over that, right? It was here, it was all over the city. What is that? It's an augmented reality. It's saying the world isn't as flat as modern intelligentsia tells me. There's some Japanese mythical creatures that I want to go find, and that's a kind of longing for something, right, beyond the mundane, right? Now the question is that what we're after? Little Japanese mythical creatures? No, probably not, right? But that's a kind of longing, right? Not just that. Think of virtual reality games, Second Life, and all the spin-offs. This is a kind of longing to enter another world. You talked about secondary worlds with Tolkien's. Well, why did Lewis create Narnia, and why did Tolkien create Middle-earth? Well, because we want to go back to those over and over again. And why do we want to go back to those worlds? Because it's awakening within us this longing for the only other world we can ever enter, which is the kingdom of God. But now we have all these other, I would call them false reenchantments, virtual worlds, augmented realities. And so here's the question. Does that satisfy this longing, these augmented, almost rhetorical, right? No, it doesn't. Not at all. And it's not just augmented realities and virtual realities, by the way. Transhumanism, post-humanism. If you read the literature on this, in fact, these are organizations like Humanity Plus and others that are trying to eliminate sickness and basically find immortality. And so here's some of the language that they use. They're basically trying to usher in the next stage of human evolution, and basically they're looking for heaven itself. But of course, it's not heaven on God's terms, it's heaven on man's terms, right? So here's a quote. Let's see. New technologies will help, here's a quote, eliminate aging and greatly enhance human intellect, physical and psychological capacities. Eventually, death itself will be overcome. This is a kind of transcendence, right? But I would argue to you it's a false enchantment. It's a false transcendence, okay? So that can't be it. That's not, so we're just going to like eliminate options. Are we good? Is that one, can we cross that one off? All right, so the next one, neo-paganism. This is interesting. Neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is interesting because Christianity, especially in the East and the South, has really been exploding. But in the West, it's not. But yet, this longing for transcendence persists, right? You can't scrub out this longing like you scrub grease out of a pan. It's not going to go away. But so what we find is this kind of obsession, and I think Hollywood bears this out, with the occult, with the paranormal, with anything that's extra mundane. So we watch American Horror Story or Grimm or I don't know, whatever it is. You guys could probably rattle off like 20 shows, right? That have something that's magical or occult or paranormal. That's a kind of longing. And if you think about it, it's neo-paganism, right? It's not paganism. What's interesting, if you think about the ancients, think about people who lived 2,000 years ago, they experienced this world very different than we do, right? They experienced the world, their world was populated with gods and goddesses, and nymphs and dryads, and rivers had gods, and seas had gods, and so on. And so man was vulnerable to the gods and vulnerable to the world. And the world was mysterious, right? Contrast that with our experience of the world today. Today we're told that we live in these, what Charles Taylor would call buffered selves, right? That we want to make ourselves immune from anything, as if we can, tornadoes usually show us that we're not as buffered as we think. But, we're told that reality is flat, but yet we long for something more than that. And so neo-paganism is this new obsession, and I think Hollywood bears that out as well. And so the question is that the object of our longing? And I think, again, the answer is no. Here's the difference. So Lewis actually thought paganism was paganism, not neo-paganism, but paganism was a necessary step on the way to re-enchanting and to Christianity, re-enchanting the world. Because he said for ancient paganism, they contained within them what he called good dreams. But neo-paganism today is not that, right? There, it's usually horrific and scary and malevolent, and there's things that tantalize and scare, and they point to an unseen reality that's actually finite and malevolent often. And so it's not like, in the end, it's offering us, I think, a kind of hell. So that doesn't seem to be right. That doesn't seem to be the object of our longing, yet it's pretty prevalent out there. Okay, are we good? Can we cross that one off? The next one, well, Platonic atheism, I'm going to call it contemporary humanism. I'm thinking of this book I just read. a guy named Luc Ferry. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He's a pretty important French philosopher. He writes popular books, so you can go to Barnes & Nobles and you can buy this. It's called A Brief History of Thought, a philosophical guide to living. So here's a guy that says, you know what? Christianity is awesome. I want there to be a God. He says, I want there to be a God. So Christianity is desirable, but he just says it's not plausible, right? So now here you've got a case somebody longs for it, but it's just not, obviously not plausible. But what he says then is, okay, we need to settle for what he calls contemporary humanism. And what that is basically the idea that, okay, there is no God, but there's something beyond this world that is valuable, like morality and beauty and things like that. And then he says things like this. Now, contrast this with what I read to you from Lewis. That's why I wanted to read the Lewis stuff. He says, the beam supporting the entire philosophical edifice of secular humanism is the possibility of loving another, if only for a moment. It's a moment of exhale. It's a glimpse, the same language that Lewis uses, a glimpse of life free from suffering. It's a, quote, eternal instance, a moment where the fear of death is itself removed. So what he's pointing to, I think he's actually identifying the very same thing Lewis was, this glimpse. But here's the thing, for contemporary humanism, he's taking the glimpse and he's settling for the glimpse. The glimpse is meant to be the sign that points to the true reality, right? But if you settle for the glimpse, what do you get? It's not going to satisfy, right? It becomes an idol. He becomes, to put it back into Lewis's terms, the contemporary humanist is what Lewis would call the disillusioned, sensible man. In other words, the guy who's given up on shooting for the moon. You know, he's realized there's no pot at the end of the rainbow. That's the disillusioned, sensible man. And that's, I think, what contemporary humanism offers you, which is, again, ultimately not satisfying. So we're down to two, pantheism and theism. Pantheism, just real quickly, what time do we go to here? I don't even know. Does anybody know? Sorry. 3:45. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. Pantheism, the main problem is that all distinctions blur. So there's no knower and thing known. There's no desirer and thing desired. And that's just not plausible, right? We are desiring animals who long for objects that satisfy our desire. So that's quick answer to why pantheism isn't so good. So we're left with theism. So I would say the most and you can think of, maybe there's some more, but for now, the most plausible explanation is that this object that we long for is God. Okay, I'll stop there. What do you think? Any questions? Is this argument interesting or intriguing? Do you think we can use it? I'd just love to hear, what are your questions or thoughts? Yeah, Lucas.
How do you suggest we become re-enchanters?
Yeah. Well, you know this, but I'm writing a book on that right now. And so I'm writing a book on cultural apologetics, and it's this very question. And so I'll give you guys, this is the answer to your question, quickly. This is my proposal. If you read, okay, what's the major meta-narrative of Scripture? It would be something like creation, fall, redemption, restoration, right? We know these things. My favorite way of understanding Scripture is home, away, and home again, the overarching story. Home, Genesis 1, God created a place, purpose, and created people. Away, Genesis 3, and then really 3 to the end, home again. So it's a good metaphor, and I think it's actually the closest metaphor for life, too. What's interesting, Augustine, as you read the Confessions, he thought all of life made sense in terms of wander, and there's a turning point, and return. And of course, if you read the Confessions, this is the story of his life, and he thought this is the story of Scripture. Same with Augustine. He writes the Summa Theologia, and he says, reality itself is structured in terms of wander from God and return. Exitus redditus is the Latin, but if you look at the Summa, it begins with God, then it goes to man, then it goes to Christ, salvation, the church, last things. So return, exit, and return. I think that this, and Lewis, of course, does the same thing. He has the same pattern. He talks about it in terms of disenchantment and reenchantment. So my proposal to your question is that we have wandered from God and we find ourselves living in what's called a disenchanted world. And by disenchanted, I mean what Lewis meant, which means that we no longer see the world in its proper light. We don't see, so the word that Lewis would continually go back to is we don't see things as holy. We don't have sacramental eyes to see the world. And there's reasons why we descended here. We won't talk about those because your question was about this side. I think there's 2 steps. I think that the first thing that a cultural apologist needs to do is understand our culture. The second thing, and that's right here. The second thing, though, is right here. We need to awaken longing. I think that's the first thing after understanding. And that's why we're talking about this. We need to awaken people to the fact that we long for goodness, truth, and beauty, and ultimately God. And then the final thing is I'm calling it we need to return to reality. And what I mean by this, so that would be so the first thing is to understand, second thing is to awaken, third thing is to return to reality. And so what I mean by that is that we need to, number 1, see and delight in the world the same way Jesus does. And number 2, we need to invite others to see and delight in the world the same way that Jesus does. That's what I mean. And Lewis's language would be, we need to re-enchant the world. So that's my quick answer to your question. Here and then Greg, yeah.
I have a question. Okay, so in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, when he talks about food and sex in the same chapter, but he's really dealing on sex. And he talks about like a striptease act. Does he talk about the same thing in that book with what we're talking about here with desires?
Is that Abolition of Man that you're talking about? I have vague recollections.
It's still, here, I have on my phone. It's where he says, there's nothing to be ashamed of enjoying your food. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their lifetime looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips.
Yeah, that's the constant theme of his writing is, I don't have it up here, but that in fact Lewis says in Screwtape Letters, he says, look, we own pleasure. Pleasure's ours. God created us to enjoy and have pleasure. But then, this is in Screwtape Letters, the demons take it and they misdirect them, and then they become distorted. And so everything that so what is re-enchantment for Lewis? If we're disenchanted, what is re-enchantment? It's to see everything in its proper light and to enjoy it in creaturely response. And so see food in its proper light and enjoy it in creaturely response. See sex in its proper light and enjoy it in creaturely response. So yeah, I think it's all, and in fact, the more that I read, the more I see this idea of disenchantment and re-enchantment through our longings is everywhere in Lewis. So yeah, I think that's a piece of what I'm trying to say to you. So Greg and then Bruno.
Back to Augustine and
Yeah.
so when I talked earlier about Tolkien and the fairy stories,
Mhm.
The escape, recovery, and consolation.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is essentially what Tolkien was looking
Mhm.
for?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, and I love in the essay, he talks about sometimes escape is heroic,
Right.
and it's when it's this literature that actually points to this underlying reality that's more real than the primary world of our experience. And so yeah, I think the escape is this, a way that entering a world that's enchanted like Middle Earth. That's heroic, because then you recover and you come back into the primary world, but you see things new. So that's a kind of heroic escape. Twilight and His Dark Material, that's not going to be heroic, because you're not going to come back into the real world with an enchanted view. You're going to come back with a disenchanted view of the world. So yeah, I think I'm finding that thinkers will cash it out differently, but this kind of an idea is everywhere, especially with the guys like Lewis and Tolkien and Augustine and so on. Yeah, Bruno and then Jim.
You were describing, and I just wanted to confirm what you were trying to say between the difference between paganism and neo-paganism. You said in paganism, of course, gods and goddesses inhabit rivers and volcanoes
Yep.
and whatnot. And then with neo-paganism, it seemed like you were saying that basically it's people in their virtual reality worlds. I was just trying to, what was the difference?
The difference? Yeah, so it's not the virtual reality stuff. It's another option, neo-paganism. And I just think of modern Hollywood obsession with the occult. Just think of the movies and everything that's out there. That's neo-paganism. For Lewis, again, he's a classic scholar, and so if he's reading and deeply into Homer and the classic Greek literature and what comes after that. And so that kind of paganism, he says, and this is true if you read Homer's Odyssey, he says you have these good dreams where you have basically the gospel story, the gospel narrative, way before Jesus comes in. You have all the things that we long for. And so he says, in some ways, these prepare us This is why when he read as a 16-year-old, he read George MacDonald's Fantasties, which is a little fairy story. He said, at 16, my imagination was baptized. And then he says, just took the rest of me a little longer. So there's something about entering the fairy world that awoken something within him. And what that was the longing for a magical world. And he says, all of us long for a magical world. Now he says later on, obviously we need to get rid of a lot of the gods and goddesses and the nymphs and the dryads. But the point is, that's a world where man is vulnerable. We might meet a god at any moment. Where divine judgment could be imminent. And that's and our experience of that world prepares us, I think, for the gospel in a way that the disenchanted world, we just don't have eyes to see anymore. In fact, theologians talk about disenchantment leads to an idolatrous way of perceiving, that we don't even perceive the world correctly, and it's idolatrous. And so I think Lewis is just saying it's a stepping stone. Obviously you can have a false re-enchantment. He doesn't want a false re-enchantment. He wants to return to see things the way Jesus does. But does that help a little, Bruno? Yeah, Jim?
I was just trying to think of possible objections that someone that doesn't believe in God might have with
Mm-hmm.
something like this. If I was talking with them, they might say something like, well, these things just sort of, this desire sort of evolved to help us survive. We desire food because that keeps us alive. So how would you maybe respond to something
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah, that's one of the two objections that are prominent, the evolutionary psychology objection. Yeah, so the idea is that this longing for God or longing for transcendence is something that's just conducive to survival, or it's a byproduct of something that is conducive to survival. And the quick answer, there's two quick things that I would say in reply. Number one, notice you're not denying that we're desiring animals. We're still longing for something. In this case, we just long to survive. And naturalism plus evolution has a very difficult time making sense of the nature of desires itself, given their metaphysical views, because desires have intentionality. They're about something. They're for things. And purely material things don't have intentionality. So that's the first thing I would say, is that chairs aren't about things, right? But my thought is about my wife right now, and so on. That's called intentionality. My desires are, for my wife, same thing. And so that's one problem with desire itself, given evolution plus materialism. But then the second thing that I would say is that, look, all these stories about survival, they misidentify the goal in life. And we've talked about this in some of our classes that we've said in this semester, that the goal isn't merely to survive. The goal is to thrive, right? And so these objections just don't go deep enough. And there's lots of them out there. I could list probably 6 right now. None of them go deep enough to the actual phenomenology, and that's why I talked about the phenomenology of the longing. None of those get to the actual longing in such a way. That's a quick response to evolution. Yeah, there, and then Haley. Yeah.
How do you see as like a practical application to reawakening somebody?
Good. I think there's 3 ways that I would think about this, and they correspond to what I said here. I think there's the way of reason, and that's, hey, let's look at this cool argument. That's the way of reason, and that's what we did here. I think there's the way of the conscience, and this I haven't explained, but it would be asking this question: what do you want in life? And the answer will always be what? What's the answer going to be? What do you want in life? What do you want to be? Happy. That's always the answer. So the question is, well, what constitutes happiness? And as you begin to probe that question, I think I call it the way of morality, because I think we all long for goodness. We long to flourish. We long for wholeness. And so there's this way of appealing to what is it that you want in life, and they'll kind of trace that through. But the other way, though, the third way, is through the imagination. And that's why I read the 3 things from Lewis. It was poetry. It was story. It was a biscuit tin that awoke him. So let's tell good stories. Let's recapture the Christian imagination so that people will become awakened to these longings that they have. So I think it's those 3 ways. I've given you one here through the path of reason, but there's 3 others. So I'm writing on this now. That's the great question that I'm wrestling with, is how do we awaken literally a world that's the Walking Dead? I mean, we're not, but you know what I mean. We're flesh eaters, and that's about it. So, Haley, yeah.
Okay, real quickly. So, if I could just talk to you Platonists real quickly.
Okay. We like Platonists, yeah.
I'm having a problem with the word transcendence in the second premise. I want this argument to work for things like truth and beauty and goodness, but I don't think that it does, because I do think that there are things in our world that do instantiate all of those things.
Mhm.
You can find
Mhm.
So, I guess I'm just asking, like, how would that work if you're going to put transcendence in that same category with truth and beauty and goodness? How does the argument work with that?
Yeah, I took away my chart. So yeah, like I think it's close. It's like right above it. The goodness, truth, and beauty is right above our longing for God. You could reformulate this argument. If you don't like the word transcendence, you could just put all of us long for God, right? And then you just got, then the premises would be slightly, then the way that you argue for the premises would be slightly different, because then you'd have to give a little more justification on the phenomenology of this longing, right?
So I guess that's what I was asking. Really, this means not transcendence. It means everybody has a longing for God.
I think it's more than that. I think it's at least for Lewis. I think it's a longing for the world made right. I think that's what he's after. And of course, God is a part of that world. He's the necessary component. But it's a longing to experience the world the way he says the enormous bliss of Eden. That's what he said about his first experience of this deep longing. The enormous bliss of Eden came to mind. So I think it's a longing for the way that things are supposed to be. So I think we could tighten this, and we'll move a little away from what Lewis was doing. I still think there's a good argument there, but I'm trying to actually, in the spirit of Lewis here, I'm trying to keep it. It's something beyond this world. So it is a kind of Christian Platonism, right? He is a kind of Christian Platonist. There's something beyond this world, and goodness and truth and beauty are all things that are beyond this world. So if you don't like that, that's fine. Just go with the God only. You're still going to get, I think, the same way. Is that what you're getting at a little? I'm not sure if I'm hitting.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what
Yeah.
I'd reformulate it.
Yeah, and you can totally do that, and I think that it would still go through. Yeah. Okay, one more maybe. Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do you account, or how does this view inform the view of sin and fall? Would you say it makes us view things that aren't good as good, or does it make us lose our longing for God, or
Yeah.
put that longing to sleep? Because you
Uh-huh.
speak in terms of a weird.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
could you speak on that?
Yeah, I think that, so I give you two things that were interesting about this one longing, that it's elusive and that there's a pleasure in that. Let me give you a third thing about it. It's non-coercive. And what I mean by that is, there's this question, it's this other question, what about those who don't have this longing? That's the thing about this argument. Well, they don't feel this longing, it's not going to persuade them, right? Well, I think there's at least three things that we can say as we be good theologians here. The first would be just the non-coerciveness of the longing. That I think that this longing is what I would call a theistic natural sign for God. I think that God has put these signs all over creation, and as well as within the human person. That's the internal side of those arguments. But to use Pascalian words, these theistic natural signs are widely available, but they're easily resistible. So God has made it such that there are millions of daily signposts for him, yet he respects our personhood so much that we can resist them. So I think we can resist this sign. We can resist it. We can also suppress it. That's the second thing I would say. So first, it's non-coercive. Secondly, though, sin it can mute this, it can dampen it, it can misdirect it. And that's part of the elusiveness of this particular thing. And then the third thing I'd want to say is, well, but God doesn't merely, is the issue of, God is hidden, actually. God doesn't just merely desire our mere belief, right? He desires our hearts. He desires that we would truly believe in our heart of hearts that he's that thing that we will find our rest in. And so he's hidden to a degree. And that's why we're not always aware of this longing. But I would just submit to you, it is a universal longing that everybody has, because we're created in God's image. In fact, all of and this is the last thing I'll say, if the most fundamental fact about reality, given theism, would be creator versus creature. This is the most fundamental fact. There's nothing else that gets more fundamental, right? If that's the most fundamental fact in reality, because there's nothing that's not God but uncreated, right? It's just creator or creature. Well, that means that everything that's created makes sense of its life in relationship to God, to its creator, either active or passive rebellion against God, right? And so that's something we can take to the bank on this one. Even if we don't feel it, fine, let's awaken it through reason, through imagination, through the conscience, whatever it takes, and the Holy Spirit. But let's point it out that way. So that's what I would say. Okay? All right. That's good. Good. All right. Thank you, guys.